The issue that I will talk about today is Europe's economic growth problem. I think it may be the most urgent economic issue in the world today. And this is simply because I think that global economic prospects actually depend more on European economic growth than on any other single development in the world. And I say this especially because the world economy almost never has done well when Europe has had a bad year. There is another reason why this is an important issue, and this is because until 2008, most people thought that the best economic model is that of Europe, not America's or Asia's. It appears that this model had successfully combined a reliance on markets with a concern for people, and it appeared to yield both growth and equity. And what has happened is that over the last 4 years, this belief has dissipated, and Europeans especially have been losing faith in their approach. Now, if you had a bad economic model, it would be good to lose faith in it and to lose confidence in it quickly, and that would not be a reason to worry. But I'll show you that Europe's economic model has many good attributes, and one should not lose faith in it too quickly. The important point, though, is that even the strengths of the European economic model cannot allow Europe or any other part of the world to defy the laws of economics, right? So I'll start by giving you an answer to the question about, is austerity the answer to the growth problem in Europe? And the short answer is that austerity is necessary, but it is not sufficient. I think it is necessary for most countries in Europe to reduce their fiscal deficits. So, for example, Spain and Greece are expected this year to run a fiscal deficit of about 7% this year. It is difficult to call this austerity. Portugal will run a deficit of more than 5%. All the countries in Europe except 5, I think, have triggered the excessive deficit procedure that they have. And this is not austerity the way it is defined in other parts of the world. So you don't actually see that much austerity currently, and I think one needs to see more. And basically, I think that it would be necessary for much of Europe to spend less on what we call social protection at the World Bank. These are public pensions, unemployment insurance, and social welfare. But this won't be enough. What is also necessary is that Europe needs to rethink its approach to work. And more than a few countries in Europe have to make doing business a lot easier. So this is a pretty tall agenda, and I think that this is a reason to worry. It's a reason to worry because these changes will require a fundamental rethinking of what is the core of the European economic model, which deals with the balance between work and life. And this rethinking will be painful. But there's another reason to worry. And this is that in responding to these changes, Europe might get rid of some of the stronger components of the economic model. So what we've done over the last 2 years is that we worked on a report that tried to figure out what has been working well in Europe and should be kept, and what has been weakening Europe and should be changed. And to answer the question about how Europe can begin to grow again, I think we need to answer this question. So what are the strengths of Europe and what are the weaknesses? Now, to do this, we first needed, of course, to define what the European growth model is. And we took a very practical approach to this. We tried to identify the principal components of any growth model, or how the main economic activities are organized. And the main ones are trade and finance. So let me take you through a few slides now. So the main activities are trade and finance, enterprise and innovation, and labor and government, right? And what we try to do is we try to identify how Europe has organized these activities and how this is done differently in Europe than in other places, especially the Americas and East Asia. We also studied how different parts of Europe actually organize these activities differently. So I'm going to give you the short summary of the report, which tries to identify what are the strong points of the model and what are the weak. And the short answer to this is that trade and finance are the strongest parts of the model, and they're doing well in most parts of Europe. Enterprise and innovation are not weak either, and they're doing well in many parts of Europe. And labor and government are the weakest parts, and they're not doing well in in most parts of Europe. And so this should give you a sense of what the report concludes about Europe's growth agenda. There are few changes that are required in trade and finance, some more in enterprise and in innovation, and many in labor and government, right? But I think what's important in trying to assess what is required for growth in Europe is to look at what have been the accomplishments of this European economic model. And to do this, one has to look back not the last 6 months or even the last 6 years, but the last 6 decades. And you have to put Europe's accomplishments into a global context, right? And when one does this, you find that Europe actually has had 3 major accomplishments. First, Europe has created what we call a convergence machine, which has not been invented anywhere else. And the simplest way for me to summarize this is that just as the United States has been taking in poor people and making them into high-income households, Europe has been taking in poor countries and making them into high-income economies. And this remarkable achievement of Europe is linked closely to the trade and finance components of the growth model. The second accomplishment is that Europe has become a global brand. And the simplest way for me to define this is that this is a unique combination of engineering and design that has made European goods and services valued and desired around the world. So if you read Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, you'll see how much European engineering and design inspired him and how much it has led to Apple's success. But the components of the growth model most closely linked with this achievement are enterprise and innovation. The third thing that Europe has done is that Europe became the world's lifestyle superpower. This term actually comes from 1990s Japan. As Japan caught up to the US, Prime Minister Miyazawa promised that his policies would make Japan the world's lifestyle superpower. But by 2000, with income still about a quarter short of those of the US, it was Europe that had become the world's lifestyle superpower. It had the highest quality of life in the world, essentially. This has been most closely linked with the labor and the government components of the economic model. And you see from these achievements that those that will be easy to keep are those that are linked with the convergence machine. It'll take a bit more work to keep brand Europe, and it'll take many changes to stay the world's lifestyle superpower. But let me take you through a few slides on each one of these. I'm going to start with Europe as a convergence machine, and then I'll go into the other two. So here's a slide that really surprised me when I first saw it. And what these slides do is that they plot the growth of consumption per capita over 4 decades since 1970 on the vertical axis, and the initial income or consumption level that the country started with in 1970 on the horizontal axis. And what you see in this chart is that in Latin America, the growth was about 2% on average, and there was no convergence. That is, a country that was poor in 1970 did not grow systematically faster or slower than a country that was rich to start with. In East Asia, what you see is that the average growth rate is about 4%, twice as that of Latin America, but no convergence again, right? And then you see in Europe, you see a fantastic convergence. What you see there is that the poorest countries grew at around 4% per year and the richest around 2%. And both these are actually remarkable because growing at around 1% per year over long periods is what has made the US the biggest economy in the world. Now, this is what a convergence machine does. This is what it looks like. So if you look at this, it is a map of the world with trade flows. And what you find is that in 2008, which is the last normal year for trade, Europe did about half of the world's trade in goods and services. And about 2/3 of this is actually within Europe. But this is precisely the close economic integration between richer and poorer countries that is the big driver of convergence in Europe. Now, people in Europe, especially people in emerging Europe, have one concern. They say that their economies are becoming overly dependent on Western Europe, and Western Europe isn't doing so well, so this doesn't spell good things for them. Actually, this does not seem to be true, and these charts show that. you find that actually the share of the new member states in Western Europe's exports and imports actually doubled over the decade. The opposite has been happening in the case of the exports of the new member states. They actually have been becoming less and less dependent on Western Europe. So European integration is a very nice thing. It means both integration within Europe and integration of European countries with the rest of the world. Okay. The other thing that has been happening is that the trade within Europe has actually become more and more sophisticated over time. It's not of cruder products like tires and plastics. What you find is that the exports of the new member states in the European Union, for example, have become much more sophisticated over time and very, very quickly. So, for example, German FDI has now led to exports of quite sophisticated things from Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. And these exports have also been going to other parts of the world, including India and so on. Now, that was trade. The other big component of the convergence machine is finance. Europe has seen the largest capital flows in the world, perhaps in recorded human history. And these charts show you that between 2001 and 2004, the EU's new member states and the candidate countries received capital flows of about 6% of GDP. If you compare those with East Asia and with Latin America, you see that they are actually more than twice those of those countries. And then what you find is, if you look at the second panel of this chart, between 2005 and 2008, these flows actually essentially doubled, right? And even countries like Ukraine and others got big inflows. Contrast this with what was happening in East Europe and Latin America, much, much smaller flows. What you find is that a large chunk of these flows actually, even in Eastern Europe and so on, have been FDI, which tends to stay for a long time. And what you also find is that foreign banks moved into emerging Europe and set up profitable operations. Now, the thing that concerns people are those dots that you see in these charts, and these are the dots below the horizontal line, and these are the current account deficits. And these went from about 6% in 2001 to 2004 to about 9% by the time of the global economic crisis. And this development has raised many questions, because this was especially what was happening in countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. These are the countries that got into trouble. Now, but the way to see if these flows are good and bad is to look at this chart, is to see whether or not these capital flows led to growth during the 2000s, or did they just add to greater vulnerability? And what we find is that when we looked at the growth rates of 4 sets of countries, these are the new member states of the European Union, the candidates to the Union, the Eastern Partnership countries, countries like Ukraine and Belarus, and emerging economies outside of Europe, right? And what you find is that countries in Europe, especially the new member states and the candidate countries, actually benefited a lot from these capital flows. Outside of Europe, you actually find that countries did better if they exported capital rather than got inflows of capital. They did better if they kept their deficits small, and even better if they had current account surpluses. Now, what is better? Do we want capital to flow from richer countries to poorer countries? Or do we want it to go the other way around? And the answer is obvious. What we want is capital to go from low growth countries to high growth countries, from richer countries to poorer countries. That way, if foreign capital is available to these poorer countries, they can consume more and invest more, and they can grow faster. The main point is what these capital flows went into. And what you find is that when you start to look at that, here's a chart that actually tells you whether or not these flows led to greater investments or greater debt, right? And what you find is that in the case of the new member states of Europe, you actually find that a large part of these flows went into investment. In the case of the EU South, countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain, a large chunk of this money actually went into consumption. And basically, what this indicates is that if you create good conditions for investing, foreign capital goes into investment. And this is what happened. This is what happened in countries like Poland and Czech Republic and Slovakia in Eastern Europe. If not, foreigners lend for consumption, and they tend to leave when things turn bad. And this is essentially what happened in Southern Europe. I'll show you a few more slides about this. But what we say in the report is that it won't be difficult to restart the convergence machine. To get it going again, Europe has to stabilize finance and then put the services, trade, and labor mobility at the center of the growth agenda. Now, we also get asked a question saying, why should the convergence machine be restarted? And the best reason is the one that I heard from Marek Belka, who is the president of the National Bank of Poland. And a few months ago, he introduced the report to the Russians, and he assessed Poland's performance in each of the 6 components of the growth model. And he concluded, and I quote, he said, "These have been the best 20 years in Polish history." And I don't think you could ask for a better reason to start the convergence machine. It has helped 100 million people in countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain converge to levels of living of those of their northern neighbors. It helped another 100 million people in the new member states get closer to high income. It is now helping another 100 million people in the candidate and the potential candidate countries of the European Union, like Turkey and Serbia, do the same thing. And we say that if it is restarted, it will help them get to high income. And then it might also help the 75 million people in countries like Ukraine and Georgia experience the best years in their history as well. So we actually are very, very positive about the convergence machine achievement of the European Union as well as Europe, and we think that it's easy to actually keep this achievement because it is associated with the components of the European economic model that are doing rather well. This is trade and finance. Now, what about the next achievement, which is Europe as a global brand? What is it that Europe needs to do to keep keep this achievement? So here's a chart which is a fairly complicated looking chart, and it really surprised me also when I first saw it. It looks at how European enterprises have done compared with firms in other parts of the world. So what you find is that between 1994 and 2009, there were very noisy developments outside of Europe. East Asia had a big crisis, and then there was the rise of China, and the US had an ICT boom and a financial crisis. During this time, European enterprises have quietly flourished. They have been delivering jobs, productivity, and exports. They have essentially added jobs at the same rate as the US. They have increased productivity faster than East Asia, and they have generated more exports than Latin America, right? That's what this chart tells you. But what this chart also tells you is that the picture is not good across the board. Job creation could have been higher in the new member states, the candidates, and that export propensity should be greater in the southeast and the south of Europe. And productivity growth should have been higher in the EU15 countries, the advanced countries of Europe, at least as high as that of the US, because productivity levels in Europe had not reached those of the US until the 1990s. So what we do in the book is that we actually focus on productivity growth because it is the best indicator of the health of enterprises. And this chart tells you what has been happening to productivity in the European Union relative to the United States. So everything is normalized to the productivity level of the US in each year. And what these charts essentially what these lines tell you is what has been happening in the countries like France and Germany, which is the top line, then countries like Finland and Sweden, which is the second line, then countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal and Greece, which is the third line, and then countries in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland and Czech Republic and so on, which is the fourth line. And what you see are two gaps emerging. The first gap is the gap between the North and the South, which has grown from about 10% in 1990 to about 25% in 2010. The second gap is the gap between the EU's continental economies, like France and Germany and the Netherlands, and the US, and that has been growing too, especially since 1995. Now, when you look at the first gap, in 2002, what we find is that productivity levels were actually higher in Northern and Continental Europe, lower in Southern Europe, and lower still in the new member states. And there's nothing wrong with this. Essentially what this tells you that a worker in Belgium was around twice as productive as a worker in Greece, who in turn was about twice as productive as a worker in Hungary, who in turn was twice as productive as a worker in Latvia or Lithuania. There's nothing wrong with this because these countries are essentially ranked from those that are wealthiest to those that are the poorest in a sense. But what we would expect is that between 2002 and 2009 or so, we would expect these gaps to become smaller. And so what we should have seen was that that productivity growth should be highest in the countries that started out from low productivity levels, and productivity growth should be lowest but still positive among the countries that had high productivity levels, countries like Norway and Ireland and Denmark and so on. And in between, countries like Italy, Spain and Portugal and so on should have medium productivity growth rates. What you actually find is that only two of those three things is true. What you find is that productivity growth was indeed high in the East. It was indeed positive and low in Northern Europe and in continental Europe, with the exception of the Netherlands. But what you see is this hole in the middle, where you see that instead of productivity levels increasing at a fairly rapid rate in countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, you ended up seeing negative productivity growth. These countries were going in the wrong direction. So real convergence in the South essentially went into reverse. So we spent quite a bit of time to see why did this happen, and I think this actually chart is at the core of the crisis especially in the Eurozone, but also in Europe. What we found was that these countries had entrepreneurial structures that were not suited for a big integrated European market. Simply put, enterprises in these countries were just way too small. So in most of Europe, for example, enterprises with less than 10 workers account for around 1/5 of value added, but in the South it is almost a third, right? And these micro firms were too small to attract FDI or to international sales and purchases. What's the reason for this? The main reason that we found is that the climate for doing business is the biggest part of the reason why the South is in trouble today. So here is a chart that summarizes the ease of doing business in 2011, scaling it from 0 to 100. 100 is excellent. And so the US is around 91. You see Japan at around 83. You see countries like Switzerland and others at around 80. And then you see a big difference between some countries in the European Union, especially those in the north, which do as well as those of the US, for example, economy. But then what you find is that continental countries like Germany and others do just okay. But countries in the south, especially Greece, do really poorly. So if you look at our rankings, for example, Greece comes in 100th out of 180 countries. And then you also see that countries like Italy come in at 87th and so on. This is the biggest part of the problem. So this is the reason why we say that austerity is not enough, because what these countries actually have to do is improve the climate for their enterprises, right? Let me go on to actually talk about the gap between the South and the rest. I had spoken about two productivity gaps. So we try to look at what are the reasons for the widening productivity gap between Western Europe's leaders, like countries like France and Germany, and those of the world's innovation leader, which is the United States. And this productivity gap had almost been closed in 1995, but since that time has widened again. Here we could not find easy answers. When one looks at the climate for doing business, it is only part of the answer, but probably a very small part. The main thing that we found is that Europe seems to specialize in lower innovation sectors like aerospace and things like pharmaceuticals, while the US is much more active in things like computer hardware and software and healthcare and so on. And this is essentially because of the absence of young innovative enterprises in new sectors in Europe as compared to the US. Now, that's actually just restating the problem and not giving you an answer to it. We try to look for the reasons for this, and what we find is that the most likely reasons are That one is that the European market is not integrated like like that of the US, especially for services. The second one is that Europe does not have world-class universities the way countries like the US have. And then the third one is that the quality of business management tends to be higher in places like the US. And finally, the US actually does better in terms of trying to get private universities to take advantage of public R&D as well as do R&D themselves and so on. What we also find, by the way, is that there are some countries in Europe that actually do a pretty good job of all of these things. And these countries actually look a lot like the US when it comes to their innovation systems. These are countries like Finland, Switzerland, Denmark, and the UK. The trouble is that these countries tend not to be that big, other than the UK, right? So we conclude that it's not going to be very difficult for Europe to actually keep its global brand, but it'll have to do quite a few things more than keeping the convergence machine. The first one is that governments in Southern Europe will have to improve their business climate. The second one is that continental countries will have to give their enterprises much more economic freedom. I'm talking about countries like France and Germany, and do some of the things that countries like the US, Switzerland, and Denmark and others have been doing. And then enterprises in the South, in places like Finland and Sweden and so on, that are already among the most innovative in the world, must be provided fuller access to markets in the rest of Europe. This won't be easy, but it won't be impossible, right? The thing that actually Europe has to confront, and confront quickly, are things associated with it being the lifestyle superpower. So I'll show you another chart that surprised me, and it shows you what superpowers do. Superpowers tend to spend a lot, right? So the US is the military superpower, and it spends more on defense than the next 15 countries put together. That's the first pie chart, right? The second one is what you see in Europe. Europe is the world's lifestyle superpower, and to protect its way of life, Europe spends more on social protection, these are public pensions, unemployment insurance, and social welfare, than the rest of the world combined, okay? So with 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, Europe spends 60% of the world's social protection spending, right? And you have to ask yourself whether or not this is sustainable. And the answer is, it is, if you really spend this money very, very well. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you have to spend this money in ways that keep people in the labor force for as long as possible. You have to spend this money in ways that get young people into jobs very, very quickly. And Europe hasn't been doing that very well. Now, the big problem also is that Europe faces very adverse demographics as compared to countries like the US. What we find is that under current conditions, Europe will lose about 1 million workers each year for the next 50 years, most of them young workers actually. Now, this is part of the reason why. The first one is that because of greater prosperity, Europeans have been stopping work earlier and earlier in their lifetimes. So this chart tells you that since the mid-90s, men in Poland, Turkey, Hungary, France, and Spain, for example, have been working about 10 years less than they used to, while expecting to live longer when they reach 1960. In France's case, for example, about 6 years more. So in France's case, which is the fourth bar from the right, what you see is that pension systems will have to pay pensions for about 15 more years now as compared to back in the 1960s. And those of you who worked in pensions know that it's impossible to design pension systems that can take such a big hit, right? Now, this is not true across all of Europe. If you look at the other side, for example, you find that Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, actually men are not retiring earlier. In the case of Germany, they're actually retiring a bit later, right? But part of the problem is that because of all of this stuff, because of this greater spending on social protection, what you see is that European governments spend about 10% of GDP more as compared to compared to the governments in similar countries across in parts of the world like in East Asia and in Latin America. And what we also found was that almost all of this difference, about 90% of this difference, is because they spend more on social protection, not because they spend more on education and health and so on. It's important to look at this chart because if you really try to identify which components of government spending add the most to growth, it's hardest to actually make the case that social protection spending adds a lot to growth. It's easier to make the case that health spending, infrastructure spending, education spending actually add more to growth. In the case of Europe, European governments tend to spend a lot more on social protection, and this is going to actually affect growth a lot more, right? Now, we also try to see is this because Europe actually looks after its elderly, for example, or its unemployed more? So here's a chart that actually indicates that it's not that other parts of the world like Japan and Australia and the US and others don't look after their elderly. They also look after the elderly. In fact, in terms of per person per year subsidies to the elderly, they are roughly the same in Europe as compared to Japan and the US and so on. That is what the left bars show over here. But what you find is when it comes to the overall drain on the treasury, you actually find that that drain is about 3 times as high in countries like Greece and Spain and Italy as compared to countries like Australia and the US. 4.2% in the case of the Anglo-Saxon countries and 12.6% in the case of the EU15 South. And it's not because these countries actually look after their elderly more or better. They just define who is elderly differently. So it's much more easy to be eligible for these pension benefits in Europe as compared to other parts of the world. This is the biggest part of the problem on social protection, and this is a part that Europe will have to deal with. Now, what we did was, as part of this report, we tried to see how much of a fiscal correction does Europe have to do. And what you see in this chart is both because of current fiscal deficits and high public debt, and because of adverse demographics, and essentially what you find is that you need a massive correction. Western Europe has to reduce fiscal deficits by about 10% of GDP, by about 6% of GDP. In the South, it's about 10%, right? So I think that for people to be asking these countries to be spending more, to be incurring higher fiscal deficits, is actually just not a responsible thing to do. Right? So I'm going to try to sum up now. And I mean, essentially what we find is that because the European growth model has so many strengths, Europe should be careful in changing it, even in response to the crisis that it is facing right now. But it does need to make some changes to preserve what has been achieved. Once again, it is important to underline what Europe has achieved. Europe is a convergence machine that makes it a great place if you are a middle-income country. Europe has a global influence that is based on painstakingly building a unique brand over many decades, and this is an asset for the advanced economies. And for all Europeans, it has meant a high quality of life that is actually the highest in the world and perhaps in human history, and it is worth struggling to keep these nice things. This is a chart that actually tells you what it needs to do. But I think that what we end up saying is that one has to start with austerity because of the charts that I just showed you, but you can't stop there. You also have to make it easier for business, especially in the EU15 South, but also in other parts of the thing, and to actually look carefully at how to make labor markets much, much more competitive. We actually also find is that you have lots of countries in Europe that have large governments, but they actually have made these governments very efficient. These are countries like Sweden and Finland and so on. But you have many more countries that have large governments that are not efficient. And these countries either have to make these government services more efficient, or they have to make government size much smaller. Right? And it's easier to actually make it smaller than to make it more efficient. So at least in the short term, the answer is to have smaller governments, not bigger governments. When governments can be made more efficient, they can become bigger.